What is the difference between working with China manufacturing and European based?
I had to move the injection molds myself at night, like Friday night. I had to bribe the security guard with 100,000 RMB in my pocket to let us move the injection mold from one place to the other.
Let's say that I'm a founder. I've got idea about some new device that I want to create, but I have no skills in order to build the prototype myself. So how should I proceed in that case?
People in China don't have the same cultural contexts that we have, so you need to be a lot more rigid with your requirements.
Welcome to the Internet of Things Equation podcast. I'm your host, Łukasz Malinowski, and let's get started with today's conversation. Everyone knows that hardware is hard, right? I mostly focus on software, and software is the easy part, the hardware is the hard part. What made you focus on the hardware in the first place?
I was living in Ireland and I met some very clever Chinese people. Then I did my internship in China and I'm like, yeah, this software stuff is very easy. I was studying software engineering myself in university and like I was looking for a challenge. So I'm like, hey, what is harder than software and what do Chinese people understand that we in Europe don't understand? And that's how I ended up working in a factory in China and discovering that hardware, it's it's hard. People think it's hard because it's unknown to them, but that is also what I want to change because it's just a process. And if you understand the process, then it gets a lot easier. It's still hard, but it's easier than you think.
Well, that's actually very true. Like once you understand something, all of a sudden it is not hard anymore, right? And I believe this is true both for hardware and for software.
Yes, I agree, but here in Europe, you don't get taught the process of hardware development, specifically universities, and there's no factories here, except in Poland and Hungary in Eastern Europe, there are some factories, but not the same skill as in China. So you don't learn as fast as you do when you live in China.
That's a very good point. So one question, what was the most surprising thing you discovered in Chinese factories that you were not thinking about that might be the case?
In Chinese factories, people use standard factory boards. Just like here in Europe, to build prototypes, we use an Arduino or we use a Raspberry Pi, this kind of open source hardware. In Chinese factory ecosystems, they also have these same boards and they also often shared between factories. And it's a solution board. And that is how a Chinese factory, if you go to the right factory, can go from prototype to mass production in 1 month, which I've done several times.
Yeah, so this is very fast regarding the cycle. And there is a saying that you should try to fail fast, right? Especially in hardware, I believe that is true because the later in the process you discover some issues, they are way more expensive to solve, isn't it?
You should try to find like your real customer and target group fast. But if you and you should be prepared to change your assumptions very fast and make sure you make all your mistakes at the start and not at the end. Because at the start they will be cheaper, and at the end they will cost you, yes, they will cost you a lot of money and your sanity.
How can you identify those issues at the very beginning? Essentially, you do not know what you do not know, right? And you need to discover everything. And in order to discover, typically the best way is to iterate very fast, but it is easier said than done. So how can you discover and iterate when you work on an actual hardware project?
I would recommend making an FMEA report, FMEA analysis, failure mode and error analysis, and updating this every week and seeing what the next failure, the big failure mode is. And this is the structured way to fail fast and to keep track of your failures.
Could you share some most interesting failures that you encounter in your career?
I worked on this modular phone case where you put several modules inside of a phone case, so you can expand your camera, you can have a better camera, you can have bigger storage, you can have a flashlight, you can have a thermometer, all inside of your phone case connected to your phone. That company got 20 million US dollar on Kickstarter. They wanted to make one phone case for iPhone. They wanted to make one phone case for Samsung because they wanted to have both users. And then they started making injection molds for around 15 SKUs, and they wanted to have black and white. So that's already 30 SKUs. And then the new iPhone came out, and then the new Samsung Galaxy came out, and then they had 60 SKUs, and yeah, this was too much. So the best way is to make one product and don't add too many accessories and make everything in black. Don't make anything in white, because I had to move the injection molds myself at night, like Friday night. I had to bribe the security guard with 100,000 RMB in my pocket to let us move the injection mold from one place to the other.
That's well, but this is, the real life lesson that you learned, right? And just for the audience, could you explain what the SKU is?
An SKU is a stock keeping unit. So, for example, this power bank is an SKU, it's one product. This USB dongle is an SKU. Every product with a specific color is an SKU.
So when you got the same product but in different colors, those are essentially different SKUs.
Yes, because you need to make them using different plastics, different mix of plastics. So you need to do a change either in the tooling or in the screw, in the injection molding screw.
Probably the first lesson is to keep things simple, to try not to stretch, but focus on few SKUs.
Not just simple. Make one and have one SKU. And if you have made one product to mass production, one SKU, then you can start making accessories and everything else.
So that is the first hardware lesson. And you wrote a book, Hardest Hardware Lessons. So what made you write that book and what that book is about?
What made me write this book is I spent 8 years in China and now 10 years in Europe. And developing hardware in China was always quite easy. I could quite easily understand it. I could quite easily go to a factory and I find someone who could fix it. But then I moved to Europe because I wanted my kids to go to school here in Europe. And Europe is a more comfortable place to live. But the companies here from Telefonica, I work for Telefonica, so there's a big company. Two small companies like Mitte, they want to make a water dispensing machine. They all make the same mistakes. They all think once you build your prototype, you are ready to mass produce it and just give it to China and China will make it for you. And that's just not the way it works. You need to interact with China and you need to make the right decisions when you work with China.
So what are those right decisions that you should make when you work with China? And what is the difference between working with China manufacturing and European based?
So with Europe, if you are based in Europe, you can be a little bit more flexible with your requirements because you are selling to the European market. The European manufacturer probably has a similar machine that you want to build in their house. They have a coffee making machine and you're making like an espresso machine. And in China, if you make something for the European market, the Chinese people, they have never seen it. For example, there's a story of a guy who went to China and he went to a shampoo factory and he wanted to get a conditioner made. And then he went to the factory and he's like, and then people asked, what is the difference between shampoo and conditioner? It's the pH, and they just didn't understand this. This was in the 90s, so of course society in China is a lot more sophisticated, but people in China don't have the same cultural contexts that we have, so you need to be a lot more rigid with your requirements. and you need to specify exactly what you want. Otherwise, people in China will interpret it in their cultural context. This is
Yeah.
probably not what you want.
I think that's very important point, because I can refer to that from the software and system design perspective, that I cooperate with companies and developers worldwide, and some nations just got different intuition than the other, right? So for something for me was very clear in terms of what I expect and how the whole thing should work, but the developer on the other side of the globe did his best, but delivered something totally different. So that refers to what you're saying, that the cultural background, even if you try to communicate clearly, it is very difficult to get the exact requirements across.
Correct. But at the same time, if you're an engineer from Europe with a European engineering degree, and you talk to an engineer in China with an engineering degree from China, these university degrees are quite similar. So if you talk in like schematics, in Gerber files, in CAD files, if you communicate properly in engineering speak, then this bridge can be overcome. But you need to do this properly, and you need to have some experience in the engineering field and not just come fresh out of university. So it's best to have a mentor who has been there before, who can guide you.
You mentioned the CAD files. Those are pretty technical, low-level descriptions, or they might be at least, right? But when you start a new prototype, you start with essentially blank piece of paper. So how you create the common understanding between you and the Chinese factory without any schematics? Or do you need to work on schematics before you even reach out to the factory?
So when you build a prototype here in Europe, and you should build a prototype for yourself first, because it's so cheap to just have a 3D printer and build a look-like prototype, then you also make a CAD file. And it usually ends up to be an STL file, but this is made in a CAD program, and this is something that people in China can also open, and then they can do design suggestions like you should change the draft angle, or you should put a bow here or a screw hole here, and they can modify the CAD file and communicate it through that.
But that assumes that I can design and 3D print the prototype myself. And let's say that I'm a founder, I've got idea about some new device that I want to create, but I have no skills in order to build the prototype myself. So how should I proceed in that case?
In that case, it's best to find a designer yourself in Europe first, or an engineer.
And do you help the designers and engineers and founders in this way? Or you mainly focus on factories and mass production?
I mainly help at the difficult step, because you can find a lot of designers and engineers here in Europe, and the difficult step is bringing this from one prototype to 1,000 working units.
Okay, so what makes it difficult to scale from prototype to mass production?
What makes it difficult is inexperienced engineers here in Europe, because here in Europe we have a culture, specifically in Germany and in the Nordics, we have a culture where we want to make a decision and everybody needs to be on board with the decision, and then everybody can take the blame if something goes wrong. And then you get this decision by committee. It takes maybe 2 or 3 months, and then you are already behind your timeline. So making this decision early and having a strong person making this decision early and just deciding that we are going for this now. Maybe in 2 or 3 weeks we find out that we want to change it, but let's make this decision now, because then we can learn this lesson in the next 1 or 2 weeks, instead of thinking about how to do this in the next 2 months and then still failing.
I think that's a great point, and it is true not only for hardware, that you need to have strong ownership, right? The owner that is willing to take a risk, because when you build something new, no matter if that is software or hardware, there is always a risk of failure, right? So that owner needs to be able to take that risk and needs to be able to make decisions and course correct in case you got signs that something is not going the right way. So what are the warning signs that you look for when you work with factories? You try to scale prototype to mass production and you see that something is not right. So how can you tell?
First of all, like you said, ownership is very important. I completely agree. And if there's not even a PowerPoint, not even an Excel sheet of who is responsible for what, from the European side and from the Chinese side, it's not going to work. The project is just going to fail. That is just clear. And if there's no project plan, or if the project plan is in a software tool like Jira, which is very flexible, and a lot of engineers in Europe are used to Jira, but in Jira you can't see the critical path. And the critical path is a tool to see what the engineers should be working on and not what the engineers could be working on and could choose to work on. No, it is what has to be done this week, otherwise the project is behind.
Yes, I think critical path is something extremely important, right? Because as you said, this is the scope that needs to be delivered in order to make the final product, whatever that is, right? And that should be the main measure that you look at if you are behind or not the schedule. So how do you distinguish topics that should be on the critical path versus nice to have that does not impact the final timeline?
You should use a proper tool for this, not a software tool. And the proper tool is usually for startup companies, it's Smartsheets or Microsoft Project. And this tool is widely used in China as well. And then on the Chinese side, it's usually SAP or Windchill, which is much more expensive, but Chinese and European companies can't afford this software.
But this is just a tool, right? And the even greatest tool will not save you if you do not know what you're doing. So how do you distinguish tasks that are meant to be on the critical path versus tasks that look important but they are not as crucial?
So it depends on the state you're in, and if you are in EVT, then you need to make sure that you are going to pass. The most important thing is passing CE certification, and you need to work towards finalizing your PCBA, minimizing the EMC radiation. And if you are not working on this in EVT, then you're never going to ship your product.
Okay, you used a bunch of technical terms. Could you explain those in simple terms for people that are listening?
EVT stands for engineering verification, and after that comes the test, so that's EVT. That is the first stage that every product development cycle goes through, and that is where you design your electronics. Engineering verification and test.
Okay, and then the certification you mentioned, why that certification is important when you build product for the European market?
It's required. If you don't have the certification, you cannot sell, you cannot import.
And that certification, is it something that you should at the later stage of the product development cycle, or should you include those requirements from the very beginning when you design the first prototype?
In the first prototype, you don't need to take it into consideration, but in your EVT stage, you need to take it into consideration because this is done usually 6 months before you start mass production. And yeah, if you don't have this, you can't sell.
But have you seen cases when prototype worked, but because of this certification, you had to significantly change the prototype design in order to make it compliant?
Yes, I've seen this, and usually European firms go through a company called TÜV Nord specifically, and this is a German company. They also have offices all around the world, also in China, and usually you send your first samples to them, and they say it passes or it doesn't pass. And that happened to me a lot. And I'm like, well, if it doesn't pass, please tell me why it doesn't pass. And they're like, no, it failed. So then I got in contact with a company called SGS, which is also a big certification company. I think they're from the US, and they also have offices in basically every country in the world, and they are a lot more communicative. So they tell you exactly why it didn't pass, and sometimes they even suggest changes that you should make in your design to make it pass the next time.
Yeah, I think that's crucial to have proper partners. When you build something significant like the hardware product, having a proper partner that doesn't only say that it doesn't work, right, but it gives you the exact insights on how to fix that, how to improve it. I think that is super, super important. Speaking about partners, how do you pick proper partner from the Chinese side? Let's say that I'm looking for a manufacturer in China. What should I look for and what should I avoid when trying to find a trusted partner?
For me, it's quite easy because I've been doing this for 20 years, so the partners basically come to me. I have a product that I want to build, and I look in a specific area in China where I know most of these products get made. For example, with Voi, we make scooters, so we have to be in Jiangsu province, close to Shanghai. And then actually talk to the Chamber of Commerce for that province, and I say, give me the list of all of the bike manufacturers or scooter manufacturers in your area. Then I get their contact details. I send an email to them with an RFP or an RFI, and then I start conversations that way.
Okay, and what are the warning signs that you are looking for at the very beginning in order to avoid costly mistakes further down the line?
What I normally look for is I always do factory visits, and actually the most interesting insight is if I do a factory visit and I see the toilets are not cleaned, or the toilets are very, very smelly, or the toilets don't have any soap, or they don't have any towels to dry your hands, and this is specifically the toilet on the assembly line, then this is a big warning sign. Because this means that management does not care about the well-being of the staff, so why should staff care about their job?
I think that's a great insight, and this insight comes straight from your experience, right? Because on the call or on the website, none of those companies show you their toilets, so there is no way for you to tell. And what are other things that you look for when you're on the shop floor? For instance, do you think that having a significant automation is actually a good thing, or you do not put that much importance on that and manual labor is also fine?
For hardware startup companies coming from Europe, going to China, automation is good because it means that the factory has capital and they want to improve their process, but it's not specifically required because a lot of things like cables, they are flexible and it's very, very hard to, for example, automate cable assembly with the robot. And to be frank, a lot of automation in China does not happen in companies that service hardware startup companies. The automation happens in the brands like DJI and Xiaomi that have a standard product that are producing like 100,000 phones or drones every month. That is where the automation happens.
So what's your take on those humanoid robots that we see on the internet that can jump and they can work in the factories? Do you think that we are going to see those robots actually working in Chinese factories, or we are not there yet?
Like you said, they jump and they dance and they take away all the fun jobs that we humans like to do. I have not seen them work in factories in China myself. I see robot arms, I see assembly jigs, which means basically a CNC robot arm that places components in a certain location. You see that a lot, but humanoid robots, I have not seen them in a factory at all. And even the
So what's your
biggest and even the biggest humanoid robot company, Unitary, they are going to make 10,000 humanoids in 1 year, which is a very, very small amount of robots. But there's also this company called Media. This is a big white goods brand from Guangzhou, and they bought this German company called KUKA. KUKA made this like amazing robot arms, and this is how automation in factories actually works, by robot arms and not by humanoids.
Yeah, exactly, because those robot arms are purpose built for a given task, right? That they can automate a specific task, but they're not, let's say, as sci-fi as humanoid robots just walking around in a factory, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
actually can use them.
But at the same time, of course, China has a big aging population problem. So if they want to keep producing things, and young people in China, they don't want to work in factories anymore. So they have to find a solution for this. And maybe one of the solutions is humanoids.
Yeah, we'll see. I think that's going to be interesting, though it is, as you know, for sure, it is not that easy to operate in an environment like a factory, right? As for a robot.
100%. We also see a lot of robots on wheels that are carrying components from one place to the other, from the warehouse to the assembly line. You see that a lot. But again, I'm very skeptical about robots.
So let's go back to humans and to human teams. What are the shortcuts that the teams are making in order to make the prototype or the mass production meet the given timeline, and then they pay a huge price because of those shortcuts?
Good question. A lot of hardware founders, they just assume that that the factory is the same as a 3D printer. So you just give it a file, and they just tell you, hey, I need to have 1,000 of these units. Please give me these units in 1 month. And these files that you normally 3D print here in Europe, they are impossible to. They're not. They are. It's possible to make them in China with an injection mold, but the injection mold will be 10 times more expensive. So they don't optimize for manufacturing. They don't do any DFM, and then they end
Okay,
up paying a much higher price for the end consumer product.
okay, so this is the technology that they decide to use during the manufacturing process. What about other things they they miss? Because what I see often from the software perspective is that founders or stakeholders, they try to reduce the cost and meet the deadline, but often they reduce the cost from the wrong perspective, right? They try to optimize not the proper things during the process, and they end up not meeting their goals. So what are the things that you can optimize during the preparation for mass production, and what are the things that you should never try to reduce because you will pay more if you do?
Yeah, so this is CapEx versus opex. Capital expenditure needs to come first. You need to spend a significant amount of money at the start to be able to make the product in the right quality. Otherwise, for example, where I work 5 years ago, we had scooters and we had optimized the the production process for piece price. So we negotiated a lot, like, hey, we want to have everything as cost optimized from a product perspective, but then we pay the price later on in repair services that we had to pay here in Europe. And then the scooters only lasted 3 to 4 years. And now we actually put in the engineering cost to design the scooters properly. And now the scooters last 10 years. And then we have a lot less operational cost here in Europe, because the operational cost in hardware companies is it's very, very high.
I agree with you that investing in proper solution design and hardware design and the manufacturing process, that might be significant costs upfront, but then you essentially got bigger margin, because otherwise, as you said, you need to support the product. And for some devices, especially in the IoT domain, if you need to support that device twice, all of a sudden your costs are higher than the margin that this device generates. So I'm not sure if that's the same for scooters, but it might end up that your whole project is costing you money instead of bringing the income.
Yeah, so it's totally like that. Because you need to do repairs or customers do returns, and then you maybe have a 10% margin, and this margin is then gone. And you could have invested like 5% more in the start, and then you would have had this margin and you would not be losing money.
So for the first time founder that tried to work with the Chinese manufacturing, what should they prepare and expect? We already covered what you need to provide. So the 3D printed prototype, some designs, right? But what else? And what is the timeline from the prototype to the mass production that you should expect?
So another thing they have to have, and anyone who talks to me about product development in China, they always need to have the PRD, the product requirement document. And a lot of times I have a template for this, so if people don't have it, they can just ask me, or they can ask ChatGPT or Claude to make a PRD for them. It's not that hard anymore. And if you don't have this, if you don't know what you want, people in China are not going to know what you want either. That is essential. And then you need to have a good connection with someone in China or someone who lives in Europe who then manages the production in China.
Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest issues in general, that if you do not know what you want, then there is no way your partner can know it better than yourself. And I think that is just the nature of life. But unfortunately, it is not that uncommon that you've got a founder that got some very blurry vision, but when you try to understand that vision in more detail, they fail to provide you those details. And yeah, that for me, that is the huge warning sign that probably I should not engage in that initiative if the owner cannot explain his vision clearly.
Yeah, correct. So this is how most people in Shenzhen work. Most Chinese people in Shenzhen work like this. They need to know what you want, when you want it, and what your budget is. If you don't know these three things, I'm sorry, you can't be helped. Go figure it out. I can help I can help founders to figure it out. But these are the three questions you need to ask as the first step.
Absolutely. Let me ask you about something else. We had the semiconductor shortage some time ago, and in a way we've got it still because of the hardware requirement for AI stuff. So how could you prepare for that? Or can you even prepare for that? As a founder, you want to build some hardware product, and all of a sudden there is no hardware anymore for you to use during the manufacturing process.
So at low volumes, it's okay. If you make 5,000 units, you can mitigate this by having a correct partner who can do spot buys and can verify chips in the market in Shenzhen. But having like mid-level volumes, like 100,000 units per year, it's very, very hard. If you ship 1 million units per year, you probably get prioritized and you get better prices and better allocation for the components. So as first-time founders, it's fine. You can find someone in China who can solve the problem for you. And that's also what I do myself. I ask some of my friends in China, hey, please find a warehouse that still has like 5,000 of these components. Find someone to verify that these components are legitimate. Find out the whole supply chain, how they ended up in that warehouse, where they've been stored, how they've been stored, and then get a verification jig. This is possible. It's possible to do. for
You
for
mentioned
for, for small companies.
you mentioned something extremely important, which is the quality of components. How can you verify that quality of those components meet your expectations?
You normally buy these components in Europe or in China through a chip distributor, and this chip distributor, the only incentive for them is to sell more components. So they're actually incentivized to help you verify that these components are legitimate components, and they can help you. They understand the whole supply chain, how they ended up in a random warehouse in Shenzhen. They can find out exactly which order from their side it came from. And there
Okay,
are and these are companies here in Europe, the chip distributors.
so once again, it's all down to having trusted partner that can help you, right? You
Yeah,
as a founder, let's say from Europe, you don't have to do it yourself, but you need to find someone that can validate those hardware components for you.
yes, because the factories can also do spot buys for you. They can buy the components for you, maybe at a higher price or maybe an alternative component, but they will not be responsible for choosing to do this because there might be a risk in this for them. So you as a founder need to find trusted partners who can then who you can then rely on to verify that these components actually work.
So what are other important hardware lessons that we haven't mentioned during this conversation that you covered in your book?
Again, make the right decisions early, specify exactly what you want, find the right partners in China, go to China, and even if you're a CEO and your job is mainly fundraising, usually a factory, it's it's your critical partner for mass production. So treat them as an investor. The factory is usually bigger than your startup company. Make a good connection with them. Meet the boss of the factory. Treat them like they will be an investor. Sometimes they could even invest in your company with money. Usually they invest with their time. So treat people with respect in the factories.
I think those are great hints. So what is the best way for people to reach out to you if they need your assistance?
They can either go to my website hansstam.eu or they can go to my LinkedIn. That's very easy.
Okay. Hans, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I think you provided great hints on how to work with China, but also how to work on hardware projects in general.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you for listening. Go to the thingrx.com to find more materials about the Internet of Things domain.